Good evening, everybody. My name is Paul Mason, and I'm here to facilitate and chair tonight's event, the latest in a series of lectures, Rethinking Public Value and Public Purpose in 21st Century Capitalism, co-organised by the IIPP and the British Library. Our speaker tonight is Professor Mariana Mazzucato. She holds the chair in the Economics of Innovation and Public Value at University College London, UCL, and is founder and director of the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, IIPP. She's the winner of the 2014 New Statesman Sperry Prize, 2015 Hans Mathöfer Prize, and the 2018 Leontief Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic thought. Her acclaimed book, The Entrepreneurial State, Debunking Public versus Private Sector Myths, was on the 2013 Books of the Year list, but more important than that, has been highly, highly influential in political thinking on the left of centre and even the right of centre in rethinking economic policy after the crash. This series, organised here at the British Library, has so far included talks from people like Richard Rogers, former Bernie Sanders advisor Stephanie Kelton, and is the whole thing, and Mariana's work, which we'll discuss here tonight, is about understanding public value, translating concepts of public value into policy, into terminology and vocabulary that the public can discuss. And I hope to, in the rest of the evening, be able to sort of elucidate and explore some of those themes. The format of the evening is that Mariana takes over in a minute and gives us a lecture lasting about 40 minutes. And then we'll have a discussion here on the stage, and then we'll turn it over to you. And the whole discussion process will itself take about 40 minutes. So thank you for coming, and I look forward to an amazing evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great. Well, thank you so much, Paul. And we were just talking in the green room over a gin and tonic. We shouldn't admit that because you're supposed to drink after your talk, not before. And we were both commenting how funny it is that our books in German, this is my previous book and Paul's great book, Post-Capitalism, were translated with interesting titles that makes one think about Das Kapital. Mine was actually translated as Das Kapital des Staat, the capital of the state. Great title. Paul was telling me that his was translated with the word Grundrisse inside, which were the notes that Marx was writing, kind of stream of consciousness as he was writing Capital. He was doing this kind of rigorous tome, volume 1, 2, and 3 on the one hand, and then he's kind of random notes on Proust, literature, and art on the other one. And I think what will be nice, I think, is if in our discussion we can also get into a bit of stream of consciousness, so we'll make this heavy book, because it is actually quite heavy, a bit lighter. And so what I want to do is really take seriously this provocative question that Big Bill Haywood, wonderful name, asked. He was the founder of the US's first industrial union, and in 1929 he said, we got a problem here. The barbarous gold barons, they didn't find the gold, they did not mine the gold, they didn't mill it, but by some weird magic, alchemy, all the gold belongs to them. And so what I want to argue is that this alchemy, this magic, is actually hidden in many ways, and it's hidden in the stories that we use to actually talk about value. And I want to sort of debunk those stories and also show why it's really important to contest the stories, the narratives, the discourses that we hear about value creation and wealth. Because otherwise, even if you have the best progressive taxation policy ever, think of Piketty's great tome where he actually finishes off by saying that a key source of inequality has actually been the lack of proper progressive taxation of wealth. I'm going to argue that no matter how much you try to tax wealth, if the stories and the discourses, literally the cartoons out there that are fed to us every day of who the wealth creators are, it will be very hard to have a stable, progressive economy, whether it's through taxation or any sort of a public policy exercise fighting for a better future. So I'm going to take quite seriously the ways that we talk about this stuff. And I'm going to focus on also some modern day critiques, because Big Bill Haywood's question in some ways has been asked in different places, surprisingly similar places, surprisingly because we have here the ex-leader of the Labour Party asking a question related to Big Bill Haywood's question back in 2011. He asked, we have to actually transform modern capitalism to be more about producers, producing stuff. And don't just think of industry. We can produce really interesting services, healthcare services. We can produce a more interesting caring economy, creative economy. But he argued that we actually had, if you want, predatory form of capitalism. And it was a really important question he asked because it went to the heart that actually there's no one form of capitalism, right? There's varieties that we can actually be co-creating, and we have a problematic one. But he really brought it back down to Big Bill Haywood's question, which is very much about value creation and value extraction, making versus taking, which is a subtitle of my book. And then on the opposite extreme in terms of if you think of the kind of spectrums of the kind of Davos conferences versus, say, a Labour Party conference, you had the CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink, saying something similar. He said, we currently have corporate governance structures which are very much not just short-termist, because there's lots of people who've been critiquing that, but actually very much centered around extracting value. And he looked at things that I'll be raising towards the end of the talk around particular practices of value extraction. For example, the increasing practice of just buying back your own shares to boost your stock price, stock option, and surprise, surprise, executive pay. And he was saying that we have to refine a sense of purpose within the big corporations, also the small companies, but he was really directing this letter to the big CEOs who he thought had sort of lost their way. They were getting too caught up in taking and not thinking enough about not only making, but what should we be making? Making things with a sense of purpose. You must, I'm sure you know, there's a fad now, actually a very important one. I shouldn't use the word fad because that sounds a bit dismissive, but of B Corps, so companies that are really trying to restructure their corporate governance to be very much purposeful, so that you don't just do corporate social responsibility on the side, but you really embed it in your value chain. Anyway, so this discussion is out there, and it's being framed in the ways that Bill was framing them back in 1929 in terms of making and taking. And what I'm going to be arguing is that this distinction actually has occurred for a very, very long time. And lots of the reason, if you want, that the book is so heavy and too long, and next book will definitely be a more airport version of it, so people can actually read it between London and New York on their way, is that this sort of gate, this fence, which I refer to as the production boundary, it used to be really debated. It used to be contested, and you actually had different parts of society, different actors in society, whether it was the aristocrats or the merchants or the workers or the owners of capital, kind of having to fight for recognition that they were, in fact, productive and not unproductive. They were making and not taking. But when we stop actually debating value, when economics as a profession, I'm not sure how many economics students are in the room, but there is a whole movement now to rethink economics. When the economics profession itself stops actually having value as a contested terrain through which economists, who then feed policymakers lots of ideas, we stop actually having this kind of tense battle, then it becomes very easy for any actor in the economy to convince others that they are in fact wealth creators. Because in fact this barrier, this fence has become very fuzzy. But this is what I'm going to try to sort of argue with you over the next 30 minutes. But first, if what I'm saying doesn't sort of resonate, just think how many times when you read, sorry, it's the fly, newspaper or listen to the news or go to a conference where some really bright person is talking about their sector or what they do, how many times you actually hear this word wealth creation or value production, right? And it's not necessarily defined. Okay, so what was actually quite striking was that Lloyd Blankfein, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, after the crisis, even after all the articles that showed just how much investment banking, and not only, but the whole financial sector had in fact been responsible, if you want, for the crisis. And again, I assume that we'll get into some of those issues later in the discussion. He actually had the nerve and the confidence. He said this with a straight face. Goldman Sachs workers are amongst the most productive in the world. So it will be very interesting for us during the course of this discussion to also link back these notions of who the wealth creators are, where wealth and value come from, also to this notion of productivity and who's productive, who's not productive, and what actually defines that. Is it because you're earning so much money, you must, in fact, be productive. My brother says this, to me all the time. If you're so smart, why aren't you a billionaire, right? Because this notion that actually, that, the billionaires are actually billionaires because they are super smart and, in fact, productive. And we know, of course, the Goldman Sachs salaries are very high. So there's this risk that we have this tautology, right? That because we don't necessarily have the right theory of value, the only potential indicator of how valuable you are is, in fact, how much money you're earning, because that is, in fact, how we tend to value things by their price. Silicon Valley wealth creators, very interesting. It was even, I'll mention later, the Labor Party itself in its struggle to understand why, in fact, it had lost the election when Miliband was running against Cameron. They actually said, we lost because we didn't embrace the wealth creators. And that word very much came down to this notion of entrepreneurship and innovation. We have to better understand how to embrace wealth creation. And Silicon Valley uses this word quite often, and even the sort of acronyms of the companies themselves. We don't do evil. This is actually Google's sort of saying, right? So we do good. We are the good ones who are doing great things, which we all value so much. In fact, we buy these products. Also, during Brexit, there was this notion that financial services had to be protected because they were so valuable. The word, again, used a lot during the negotiations. It was very important to ring fence this very valuable part of the economy. There's a whole debate out there of what the right price should be for medicines. And there's this notion that, in fact, the prices that exist are based on value. So value-based prices. They are very high prices, which have seen recently, especially since the financial sector itself. So hedge funds and private equity firms have started to interact actually with the drug industry, that these high prices are actually justified through value-based pricing. And if you look down into, well, what do they actually mean by value? It's not necessarily this coherent concept that is equally shared even amongst the other notions here, right? So it's this very kind of weak, easily malleable concept that then gets used to justify all sorts of things. And the state itself, right, is it a value creator, or is it at best a redistributor of value created in the private sector? I would argue that, in fact, one of the reasons why progressives worldwide have lost some battles, both in elections but also in more commonplace debates, is there's been almost too much emphasis on redistribution, whether or not we've achieved those very important redistributory policies or not, and not enough on how we actually create the wealth in the first place. And unfortunately, then that leads to lazy assumptions, which wealth is created in business, and then at best what government can do is facilitate it, de-risk it, level the playing field, and again, redistribute through taxation that value. Okay, so these stories, these narratives, the words are used all the time. And for some, you definitely think they're value creators, as Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, and others, government will note, you wouldn't call them value creators. In fact, this is why I think civil servants are so depressed. I often say that when I go talk to different public actors around the world, I walk in as an economist and I walk out as a life coach, because, in fact, the level of depression is quite high. If you're not seen as a value creator, it can be a bit, sad. Anyway, and I was really struck. I mean, one of the reasons I wrote the book was, in fact, that I just found it quite scandalous that even a party called the Labor Party would sort of just dismiss this much more collective creation of value, where, of course, labor creates value, different types of state entities create value, of course, businesses create value, and of course, civil society creates value. We would not have weekends. We would not have an 8-hour workday without trade unions actually having fought for that. And that was a very important, if you want, a shaper and co-creator of the kind of markets that we have today. Carl Polanyi, by the way, if you're interested in this idea of different actors coming together to co-create value and have conflict in the process. This is not an easy thing. This is often full of, this is often a battle. Trade unions battled for those things. But again, different types of public, private, third sector, civil society actors co-creating value. This should be at the heart of any progressive agenda. And yet we were told that this was, the title of a piece I wrote in The Guardian, just kind of making fun of this very lame analysis that occurred after that election by the Labor Party itself. So my my call for action was, let's rethink where wealth comes from, and neither just say, let's tax the wealth, as Piketty did, as important as that book is and was. I mean, he continues to do that fantastic empirical research. It's just not enough to limit oneself to taxing the wealth, and it's also not enough to say we need to somehow just encourage all sorts of actors in the economy to come together, if then the wealth creation process itself gets limited to being understood as just in business. And this is really important, okay? So Plato was not a dumb guy, right? He wrote all sorts, or said all sorts of incredibly important things. And I think one really interesting insight was that, storytelling actually enables rulers to rule. And we should really be questioning then, again, coming back to Piketty's data, this fast rising level of inequality in most developed countries after 1970, the degree to which then the data that he looks at and the different types of taxes that he blames for having increased the unequal distribution of wealth actually also came about from particular stories, literally the lobbying efforts that went behind particular types of tax policies. And I've looked at some of these. So in my previous book, The Entrepreneurial State, I looked at why did capital gains tax fall by 40% in just 5 years at the end of the 1970s. And it was through very active storytelling and lobbying by, at the time, the National Venture Capital Association, through the story about where innovation comes from. You want a knowledge economy, you want a more innovative economy, well, reduce our capital gains. And then actually what happened, and you need someone like Warren Buffett to say this, and believe me, he's not a communist. He says, why did you do that? I don't even look at capital gains. I invest when I see an opportunity. And all that actually did was increase inequality and didn't necessarily create jobs. But what I'm interested in, what are the stories and how do we actually frame this debate about value, and how has that actually been used to allow the 1% and 99% kind of dynamic, which everyone knows is so important, especially to young people today who are trying to upset that status quo. So what's really interesting is that in the history of economic thought, and again, I kind of labor through this in the book, this idea of identifying, well, how can we actually shape an economy so it actually really nurtures value creation and not value extraction, has always been a feature of how economists debated. And this was often related then also to what Marx would call the mode of production, how production and distribution were actually structured. So when you had the mercantilists at the time of, think of the time when we had the 1651 Navigation Acts, where the whole idea was that you had to focus on the terms of trade, so focusing on exchange rates, taxation. This is actually something that Trump has brought us back to 400 years ago, this idea that actually we had to get the right terms of trade, terms of exchange. They actually very much did that because they thought it was trade itself that created value. And that's why they put so much emphasis on those terms of trade, like those Navigation Acts. In the time of the physiocrats, this is when we didn't have the Industrial Revolution yet. It was still very much an agricultural society. They were writing in the 1700s. These are, probably never heard of them, but people like Quenet and Turgot, they really thought that value lay in farm labor. And they were very interested. In fact, I think, let me just skip over, I'll come back to this in a minute. They actually created the first ever Excel sheet. Quenet actually divided up the classes, the productive class, the proprietors, and the sterile class. So you had the landlords here, the merchants here, and the farmers there. And they were very interested in the degree to which the wealth that was created by farming actually then found its way back in. It wasn't siphoned off by the unproductive members of society, whether they were kings or the aristocrats. But at the heart of their theory of value was, in fact, farm labor. The classical, so Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Karl Marx, very much during the Industrial Revolution, as it was taking fold, were starting to put emphasis on value as embodied in industrial labor, literally in the working process itself. So Adam Smith's famous book, The Wealth of Nations, he had a very long description of the division of labor. You might remember the pin factory example for those of you that read Adam Smith. So even though he's known for this concept of the free market, actually what he very much did was really try to understand what was the relationship between what was happening in the factories and the rising division of labor. So you no longer had craft people making everything, but that process actually being broken down into very small little bits. What was the relationship between that process, division of labor, increases in productivity, technological change, and also, and this is something that both Ricardo and Marx focused on a lot, then the distribution of wages, rents, and profits. So there was a very strong connection between industrial production, the focus on how laboring methods were changing. This wasn't a deterministic theory, right? They focused a lot, actually, on technological change. If you read Karl Marx, you will actually admire just how much, in some ways, he appreciated capitalism as being a system fundamentally different from feudalism, which had basically been 500 years of inertia. Capitalism being a system that was being constantly kind of revolutionizing different technologies, means of production, and the question was, what is this actually then doing to distribution between the different classes of society? And what I'll argue is that the modern day theory that is taught in economics departments worldwide kind of made this much fuzzier. And it's not right or wrong, by the way, right? I mean, I actually, my point is not to say this is wrong and we should go back to some sort of labor theory of value tied to objective conditions of production. But what happens when you have emphasis, and I'll go through this in a minute in some more detail, just on preferences, so wages themselves become no longer tied to objective conditions of production, tied to including things like the class struggle, right, which are objective conditions in terms of power relationships, but to preferences of leisure versus work and demand and supply curves determining prices, which then are used to determine value. This is a huge revolution, right? So in some ways, what these guys did was they first had a theory of value, very different one from another, which determined a theory of price. And what the neoclassical revolution did was put the logic completely the opposite. You have a theory of price, supply and demand, which then turns into a theory of value. And what I'm going to be doing is really kind of going through what then the implications are of that revolution, which, by the way, most economic students don't even realize. Not because they're stupid, but because they're not taught history of economic thought. And this is really important because, as I said before, there is a whole movement out there to rethink economics, because many people, not just students of economics, feel that there was a real sort of problem, that many of the policies that were problematic, which in fact contributed to the crisis, were reflections also of problematic theory. There was a feedback between the two, and yet there wasn't really a revolution then in economics departments. But unfortunately, I would argue, this is a bit of a contentious thing I'm about to say, the movement, I think, really needs to also fight for much more unpinning, if you want, of the underlying assumptions within the value theory that's taught, because otherwise what you do have in some departments of economics which sell themselves as rethinking the curriculum, they're actually making standard theory just more user-friendly, right? So applying it to different areas which are really interesting, the issues around climate change, issues around gender, issues around race, really important issues, but if you use the same body of theory, the same underlying assumptions, even the same mathematics, but you're just making it more user-friendly by taking the math away, that's a problem. And we shouldn't forget that actually mathematics itself is just a tool. And this as well has been quite interesting for me to see how, again, this movement has unfolded. Is unfortunately, it's also become a call for taking away the math. Again, that's part of the user-friendliness. And yet there's a very specific kind of math that's used in modern day neoclassical economics, which is basically coming from Newtonian physics. So lots of emphasis on center of gravity, unique equilibria, averages, right? Whereas there's a whole other body of mathematics that could be used, for example, from biology, focusing much more on disequilibria, multiple equilibria, heterogeneity. If you think of evolutionary biology, very important, and how it looks at the coevolution between differences, between different, in this case, economic agents, and selection pressures, which winnow in and only allow some agents to survive and to grow. So there is, in fact, a whole body of mathematics that could be used in economics, which is not used from biology and not from Newtonian physics. And so this is the danger, that if we just focus on sort of the symptom, which is, yes, there's a lot of math there, which has cut off the discussion of what economists are talking about with sort of normal people who maybe didn't do maths and further maths A levels, that it's a bit dangerous, because that also makes economists feel like they're really, really smart. Oh yeah, these people just don't get math. Let's just make it a bit easier. As opposed to saying, hey, why are you assuming, again, that we will necessarily arrive to a unique equilibria, or that all these differences between, say, wages or profits or economic actors and their behavioral characteristics will somehow be competed away, and you'll come down to some sort of representative agent. Anyway, so that was a bit of a side. Now, Adam Smith, let me just say a bit of each one of these. Adam Smith was quite interesting because he, in fact, was very, in terms of the production boundary, he was very damning. He actually thought that some were productive and some were not productive. He did tie it back to this notion of labor. So he said that there's one sort of labor which actually adds to the value of the subject upon which it's bestowed, and another one that doesn't. That's unproductive labor. And he made a whole list of the unproductive parts of society, and it was very interesting because you must think that he had just been to the opera or something and had the worst time ever, because he didn't just put opera singers, he also put the musicians and the opera dancers. That's three different people that he probably really didn't like that evening. But this was quite interesting, actually, because what Marx did instead is he tied it very much to how he understood surplus value was being produced. So how profits were being produced, which he tied to a theory of labor being actually exploited by capital, which I'm not going to go into right now. We might get to that probably because Paul's super bright and we'll probably dig away at some of these quick slides that I'm doing. But what was interesting in Marx, and I'm going to come back to this at the end, is he wasn't so deterministic. It's funny because many people critique Marx as being very deterministic, but actually he thought it depends. If you're driving a truck and you're driving the truck and actually on its way to bringing goods to a factory which then are related to how profits are then earned, then you're actually productive, because this wasn't a normative theory. He was actually just trying to understand where value comes from, and himself, like the other bodies of thought before the classicals, trying to understand what happens not only when some of it is then siphoned off, but what happens then if you have technological change which starts to replace labor, and if labor is the source of exploitation and profits, what actually is going to happen to things like the rate of profit. Anyway, he asked really interesting questions, but he was less deterministic than Smith, who actually just named, you are productive because you are a worker, you're unproductive because you're a lawyer. It depended on what they were actually doing. What was interesting also in Adam Smith is, and the classicals, their notion of rent, which I, in the book, kind of proxy as the notion of value extraction, was, he actually said it's robbery. And it's unearned income. There's things that people are doing which are not actually producing anything, but prices are being charged. And I'll come back to this in a minute when I compare the notion of rent with neoclassical economics. Anyway, so the implications from the classicals is that the relationships between value, prices, and income were tied to objective, not subjective, not based on opinions or how much you want something, but actually objective conditions of changing characteristics of production. And those changing characteristics, again, also have to do with working conditions and the fights for bettering those conditions. The relationship between production and income, meaning what people are actually earning, wages or profits, was mediated through also power issues. Who owns the means of production? So workers' wages were not just in terms of how productive they were, but actually their power in that relationship. They focus very much on reproduction of the system, just like the physiocrats did, which again, if too much starts to get siphoned off by those that are not producing enough. So think of the modern day debates around the financial sector in terms of extracting value. What happens when too much is siphoned off and not replowed back in? Again, I'll come back to finance in a minute. And this very important distinction that rent itself, if you think of the different forms of income, profits, rents, wages, and interest, was actually about unearned income. Okay? And what neoclassical economics did was sort of turn all this on its head, as I've already said, from a focus of value in the objective conditions to price to the opposite, so that there's emphasis on supply and demand and marginal utility curves and preferences where, again, workers' wages themselves are tied to their preferences for leisure versus work, completely changed that focus on those objective conditions of technology, production, machinery, and factories. In modern day society, we wouldn't just thinking about the old kind of factory, but literally production. Think of data. Where does data come from? Who's producing it? Who's investing in whether it's the internet or the different forms of sharing of data? Whose data is it, right? These are all objective questions versus how much would you pay to access a particular site, or just because something's free, is it really free? When every click you do brings money somewhere else, and that's based on your preference when you click on a website. So how do we actually measure value in that case when there isn't a clear mapping of sort of who's doing what? And this is very interesting also because it is tied, in fact, this notion of preferences and the focus on preferences then to this notion that everyone's kind of earning their marginal product. So wages themselves are the marginal product of labor. Profits are the marginal product of capital. So the distribution, this is one of the first ever neoclassical economists, the distribution of the income of society is controlled by natural law. the law if it worked without friction. So if we didn't have all these incompetitive, problematic processes on the way, would actually give rise to a fact that every agent of production earns the amount of wealth which that agent actually creates. Right? So you can start seeing where I'm going, where blank sheet saying we are the most productive in the world, we earn a hell of a lot of money. It must be tied to what we're producing. So the implications here, and this is what is taught worldwide in economics departments and micro 101, they don't even call it a theory of value, they just call it economics 101, is the class struggle completely disappears. Wages, in fact, are, as I said, tied to preferences, not to any sort of power relationship. Price reveals value. I earn loads, I must be productive. And rents, and this is very important, rents, okay, so the ability of a particular sector to charge in excess, if you want, of what it's actually doing is no longer about unearned income, but about some sort of asymmetry. If you go back to this notion of competition, working without friction, some sort of natural competitive law, rents are no longer about unearned income, but asymmetry towards some competitive price. So rents can actually be competed away if we just come back to some sort of competitive situation. And what I argue is that this kind of disappearance then of a notion that there's a way to produce things and you have different actors, and of course businesses are key to that production process, but there's others. You have labor, you have, and again, I mentioned Polanyi before, who very much put emphasis on different types of public policies which have been essential. He actually argued the free market itself was pushed into existence. So when you no longer have a mapping of the different actors in terms of what they're actually producing and tied to changing objective conditions, but actually objective conditions that one can actually understand through understanding modern day 21st century digital capitalism, then it becomes very hard actually to even have this debate of who's productive, who's not productive. It just almost becomes, value is in the eye of the beholder. It depends how much things are actually being demanded, how much we value data, how much we value a medicine. If you will die without the medicine, you obviously value it immensely, right? But if then the cost of that medicine is completely not taken into regard in terms of the pricing, but it just becomes how much people want things, and then notions of value, like value-based pricing, are used, we're in trouble. And so, again, the point of the book was to say we need value to come back to the center of economic theory, and we shouldn't forget, I keep saying the economists and economic theory, and you might be thinking, who cares? Who cares about economic theory? Who cares about the economists? Let's just talk about, real things. And you should remember what Keynes said, and he was very right on this. He said, all these practitioners out there who think they're just doing stuff, getting work done, whether they're in city government, regional government, national government, or people just working and trying to do their job well, are often slaves of defunct economic theory. Economic theory, unfortunately, is incredibly powerful to our understandings of wealth, of who deserves what, of why countries grow more than others, of which members in society deserve what they deserve. What they get. So coming back to a heated discussion about value, and instead of calling it Economics 101, actually contesting that, I think, is incredibly important. So what I'm going to do now is just, in my last 12 minutes, what I'm going to do is go through kind of just 4 or 5 hugely important implications of all this, right? Of when we move from debates, contested theories of value to a theory of price, to the opposite, theory of price to theory of value. So the first is, and I used to teach, even though I do more kind of industrial economics and applied micro in economics, I used to teach basic macro when I was first trying to make money as a PhD student, and it was really fun when you talk about GDP, because you can really shock the students by saying, guess what happens to GDP if someone marries their cleaner? It falls, right? Because that thing which someone was already doing and getting paid for it, now perhaps if you marry that person, man or woman, let's keep this gender neutral, is still being done, but they're not being paid for it, right? So we actually put into GDP things that have prices. And so if that thing is still being done, but you don't have a price on it, it falls. But this is, recognized. You don't need me to write that thick book to tell them. The opposite is when really important things are not valued, and if you think of pollution, what it does to the environment, what happens to GDP? It goes up, because the actual creation of GDP, unless you have something like a carbon tax, will not necessarily make GDP fall until you go clean up the pollution and GDP rises, right? So this is just kind of the obvious thing that most people know, which is a problem. But what started to happen in the 1970s is that a certain part of the economy, which let's just call it financial intermediation, so the whole financial sector, which is not just banks, but also private equity and the hedge funds, the whole, if you want, shadow banking sector, was completely outpacing the rest of the economy. And it was really hard, actually, for the people doing the national accounts at the time to understand this, because things like net interest payments, the difference between what a bank earns in interest and what it pays out in interest, wasn't sort of really being priced. It was just kind of income, right? So what was going into GDP at the time, until 1970, was just the fee, for example, that you might pay someone to find your mortgage for you, because there was a very clear, there's a price to that, put that into GDP, right? And what became very interesting is when you don't then have a theory of, is this all this rise in financial intermediation, this is data from the Bank of England in the UK, which shows just how much financial intermediation as a part of the economy outpaced the growth of the rest of the economy. If you don't actually have a theory of value, or I should always come back to debate and contested terrain about value, the question they pose themselves is, oh, well, we better give it a price, as opposed to ask, is this actually contributing to value? So, the service, right, because we have national income and product accounting, so everything that we put into GDP has to be accounted as actually producing something, a service or a good. The service that commercial banks were producing was called financial intermediation. The service that investment banks were producing was risk-taking, right? And these two things became part of GDP, and we gave it a price. So the net interest payment, for example, of commercial banks was what then was included as being the price of financial intermediation. And this is a problem. Oops, sorry, this is not going back anymore. This is just very interesting, actually, because then U.S. financial corporate profits as a share of total domestic profits also started to rise in that period. Ignore what happened after the crisis. And again, this shows you this kind of direct link between how we sort of think about value and then that kind of income generated from it. And there was not, and this is exactly why, again, Blankfein could make that statement, right? We are obviously producing value through financial intermediation, and look, our profits are actually generating that. Corporate governance is quite interesting because, in fact, I just mentioned the risk-taking function of investment banks. There's a whole theory of risk behind this notion that firms should actually be maximizing their shareholder value. And this is quite important to say because there's been many people, like John Kay in the UK and others who've critiqued this notion that companies are just maximizing their shareholder value. They should also maximize all sorts of other things. But in trying to debunk the underlying theory of value, it's quite interesting to go into the textbooks that actually defend that form of corporate practice, MSV, and it actually comes down to a theory of who is creating the most value in terms of being willing to take on the most risk. So there's a theory of the residual claimant by someone called Michael Jensen, and his textbook was very important in the 80s and 90s in business schools worldwide, but he's still studied, where the idea is that everyone except shareholders have a guaranteed rate of return. And so workers have their salary, and banks earn their interest rates, and governments aren't really taking risks anyway because they're boring bureaucrats. And so if there's this is what people think, not what I think. And so in the end, of the biotech boom or the dot-com boom, if there's anything left over after everyone's taken their guaranteed share, then that goes to the shareholders, right? And so they are the biggest risk takers. They should, in fact, they merit going away with this big booty, as we always have after a big revolution. And we're about to witness, I believe, a big bubble around clean tech, by the way. And so this, again, is quite interesting because it completely dismisses the fact that actually all those different actors also took risks. Just think of workers when they accept a wage in a company that might be lower than the one that they would prefer, thinking that they might have some sort of lifelong career in the company. There's no guarantee. The government, when it makes its investments in things like the internet, GPS, all the things that are in your iPhones that I talked about in my previous book, there's no guarantee that that's going to go well. For each internet, there is many failures. So this idea actually also of risk as only being taken on by particular elements of society actually also then justified certain practices, which today many people are critiquing, which I think can only be debunked by really revealing the problematic understanding of value underpinning it. This data here is just showing particular financialized practice around share buybacks, which I already mentioned before. So many of these companies up here are spending over 100% of their net income in the combination of share buybacks and dividends to boost shareholder prices, stock options, and executive pay. And so in terms of consequences, this this isn't moving on. Is it dead? There we go. And so the percentage of cash flows returned to shareholders has risen sharply. The CEO to worker compensation ratio in the US as well. The profit-wage relationship is at record levels. There's no problem in profits today. There's a huge problem in the degree to which these profits are being reinvested. And this has affected then, as I just said, the profits being reinvested back into production, which is the part of GDP we call business investment, right? GDP is government spending, investment, consumption. Net exports, investment worldwide in many developed countries has been falling on trend as a result of this financialization. These very high prices that I've already mentioned twice now around the pharmaceutical industry, they used to be justified by the large companies by the cost of R&D until it was revealed through many people's studies, including my own, just how much of that really uncertain part of the R&D, the high-risk R&D, was being taken on by different public entities like the National Institutes of Health in the US, which spend over $30 billion a year. And so they had to come up with another sort of justification. And this is the best, I think, depiction of this problematic reverse kind of engineering of the logic, which is that instead of saying, of course, the prices are very high because we spend so much, it became, well, the prices of the drug should actually be based on how much consumers actually want that drug, how much they themselves perceive the value of that drug to be. And there's actually a formula that's used for value-based pricing. And just imagine if your child is sick and dying, how much you would value a particular drug. That price could be infinite. But I encourage you to look into this because it's quite revealing. And Goldman Sachs, which every now and then just says things that are beautiful, besides the CEO's quote before, curing patients actually is a really bad model because then they won't need these really expensive drugs that are being justified through these crazy formulas. Anyway, moving on. It's very interesting also to think about the whole digital economy today and the debates that are happening around Facebook and what the issue should be in terms of privacy and regulation. Even the word, to be honest, regulation or government intervention, I find incredibly problematic in this area because the idea is, as I was mentioning before, that value is created in business and then you sort of come in later and make sure everything's right. Oh, we got to regulate it. We got to intervene. We got to make sure that privacy is, respected. Whereas that data itself, first of all, it's the people's data. That technology itself was invested in to a large extent by taxpayers. What would Facebook do without the internet, which was funded by the taxpayer? What would Uber do without GPS, which was funded by the taxpayer? The real question should be today, how do we actually produce a platform/digital value which really takes into account that collective effort, both in terms of that collective data of, it's people's data, but also that it itself has been actively shaped and co-created in terms of a wide array of different types of investments. And by not having theories that come back down to that, who produced what, how can we actually shape this in different ways, it becomes very easy for the big tech companies to really present themselves as having created this great stuff, which then these boring governments try to impede the wealth that's created from it. Okay, fine, we'll let you regulate us a bit. But it's quite extraordinary. And I think also the whole UBI discussion itself has unfortunately fallen a bit prey to that. Because this idea, and it's not surprising that it's being supported so much by the tech companies, that value is created again by, for example, Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, and then you need handouts given by government to everyone to make sure that they have some sort of basic guarantee of income because the robots are coming and who knows if we'll have any jobs, kind of misses the point. Wouldn't it be more interesting if we really recognize that this value that's being created, whether it's through energy, the green revolution, whether it was through the internet revolution, whether it's through the modern day data revolution, has actually been, again, created through a much more collective group of actors than the ones that we assume, and that in fact what we should all have is a share, or if you want, a dividend of that collective value created, but not really as a fight between each individual, that's my share, that's your share, but really also start thinking perhaps about public repositories of the data, which the companies themselves pay under certain conditions to have access to. Conditions, obviously, that would have to be agreed by independent authorities that would have public value in mind, versus the kind of crazy situation that we have, which is the reverse of that. And of course, I've already mentioned this joke about me feeling like a life coach with governments, which I speak to around the world, but it really is extraordinary. When you don't have a theory of government as creating value, not just in the narratives, right, the usual distinction of the cool entrepreneurs and the boring bureaucrats, it also actually gets incorporated that way into GDP. So in GDP, we only include the salaries, the costs of what government does, not the actual value of what it creates. So it's actually almost impossible to do what Blankfein does in terms of productivity numbers for a government, because we actually don't even have a real measure of the value of the products that are produced, especially when those products are free. But even regardless of that, you have a whole array of theories and like public choice theory, new public management, which have actually really made civil servants scared of failing, right? Because they're going to be on the front page. The idea is you get captured, you get corrupted really easily. So just stick to the basics, rules of the game, level the playing field, and don't have any sort of ambition or mission to do anything. And ironically, that's actually when they get captured the most. But this notion that government isn't a key co-creator alongside these other agents of value actually makes it very difficult for it to do anything as ambitious as setting up the welfare state as it did in the past, or going to the moon and back again in one generation. Let me just skip ahead, and I just will take 1 extra or 2 minutes over. Sorry, my timer just went off. So what to do, right? Now, this all sounded quite damning and depressing, and both because economic theory is problematic, and then all these terrible things happen. But we can reverse it. Remember in the beginning I said there's different forms of capitalism. And in fact, if you start with the presupposition, I can't even say it, presupposition, that value is collectively produced, that markets themselves are actively co-created and co-shaped by these different actors, then, when I compared Adam Smith and Karl Marx, instead of just saying, oh, hedge funds are terrible, finance is bad, and we must have an industrial policy and make stuff, right? This kind of narrative that's come back, we can steer all sorts of activities into the production boundary. But that requires not some sort of deterministic theory of value, you're productive, you're not, but notions in society that would hopefully also be debated through different types of democratic institutions of what kind of value do we even want to create? I mean, that's the whole point of having a democracy, right? So there are, of course, many different discussions around the circular economy, the green economy, the caring economy. Just think of the big debates in the UK right now on how to restructure health services. How could this actually itself be used to reorganize not just production, but literally different members of society in producing what's important? So in this institute that I've set up, and that's actually organizing this series with the British Library, we put this at the core of what we want to do. And we also gave it a name of public value, but not just public value meaning created by the state, public in that collective sense. How do we create it? How do we nurture it? How do we evaluate it? How does the Treasury evaluate this process when it's much more messy? And just literally, last point, this concept, I just mentioned going to the moon and back again. That was very ambitious. It was really risky. It required all sorts of actors, all those collective actors that I talked about. And why could we not actually today really take seriously something like the Sustainable Development Goals, which over 100 countries have signed up to, and really use them to form concrete sort of challenges, or if you want, create challenges for governments worldwide, turn them into missions, right, as bold as going to the moon and back again, and then think of all the different sectors, so all the different sectors in the economy in terms of industrial sectors, so transport, nutrition, AI, the social economy, but especially using different instruments then to really crowd in, bottom up, lots of experimentation, exploration to get there, because that actually is what happened going to the moon, right? There was about 12 different sectors that got us there, including clothing, and lots of bottom-up experiments that were fostered, of which many failed. And so actually bringing back the boldness of we can actually have public purpose driven policies, which are actually trying to achieve something that we debate in society that's important, which we have signed up to in terms of the SDGs. SDG 14 is about cleaner oceans. Make it really concrete. This would be one way to do it, take the plastic out. But then instead of having the Labour Party reaction, oh, we lost the election, we have to be more business friendly, and then do what so many governments do, which is go ask business, what do you need? Which tax cut do you need? Do you need an R&D tax credit or a patent box policy? Really open it up to say, hey, who's willing Who's willing in society, all sorts of different actors, public, private, third sector, to go after that challenge? And then you use government instruments, whether through a public bank, whether particular types of subsidies or tax credits, to actually bring in the willing. You don't pick the winners, you bring in those who are willing to co-create together the value that's required in order to actually achieve something as concrete as that. And I only bring it up here because this is something that we're doing not only in the Institute, but also through our activity in Europe. And we're very proud, actually, to have written a report that led to that those images came from that. There's different missions that we've been thinking about also with the UK government through the mission-oriented industrial strategy. But I found that all the kind of nitty-gritty of what we're thinking in order to do that, almost at each point of the way, forces to rethink this term value, and also the contracts, the collaborations, the relationships, the deals between these different actors. The legal system actually formulates the collaborations between actors, and if one is seen as a value creator and one is at best a redistributor, you can bet that contract is going to be abusive. I'm finished. So.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you, Mariana. So we'll just have a quick chat, and then we'll throw it open to you. My question is really fundamental. Okay, you critiqued, going back to the mercantilism theories of value. What is your theory of value? And I think practically we're surrounded by other theories of value. We're beyond, in many ways, the the marginalist era. We've got people wanting the government to measure happiness. We've got the climate lobby, basically trying to place monetary value on the depletion of the environment. We've got co-ops, we've got credit unions, all trying to work outside a classic marginalist framework. So what is your explanation of where value comes from?
Right, so I guess I wasn't clear enough. Should I do the whole, no, just kidding. So that last slide that I put up, for me, those would be the key pillars. First, values created collectively. That might sound like, obvious, but it's not so obvious. So even in the previous theories, I'm not going back to any one of them to say they were right. What was very interesting to me was, oh, sorry, I was supposed to hold this. Is this on?
Yeah.
Nice and big. Was just how nested they were in their understandings of where value came from, given the societies that they were living in, right, from agricultural to industrial. But I don't think that just because we're living in a digital society today, an internet-based system, that we say, oh, value comes from the internet, comes from digital. For me, it very much comes back to how, what kind of digital capitalism do we want, first of all? My collaborator and deputy director of the Institute comes from Estonia, Rainer Cattell, who's in the audience, and it's very interesting what's been happening in Estonia, where they are used as the kind of poster child for e-governance. But this has happened in a period in which inequality has risen quite radically in Estonia. So when you don't have an objective in society of, say, inclusive growth, sustainable growth, even innovation-led growth, this country, by the way, continues to grow through personal consumption in terms of those four categories of GDP. So private debt to disposable income is at record levels, back to what it was just before the crisis, and that's what caused the crisis. So you should be a bit worried by that. If you want investment-led growth, innovation-led growth, then how do we bring these collective value creators to decide how to get there? And unfortunately, when you only have this idea that value is created in business, what you end up having in each of these countries, which talk about themselves as we're going to grow through innovation, is they end up asking business what they need, right, in order to create this kind of innovation-driven economy. And so value is created collectively. It should be shared collectively, not through handouts like the UBI handout, but literally, let's rethink how to redistribute the wealth, not just through taxation. Also, of course, we should have a progressive taxation system, but actually understand the wealth itself as having been co-created. Otherwise, what you get is philanthropy-based capitalism. You have really problematic business models, which then create huge cash piles. Just think of Microsoft's cash pile. It's a very financialized corporate structure at Microsoft. And then they take some of that and put it into a philanthropy that does good, right? Versus doing good actually through your value chain and how you do your corporate governance. So a stakeholder-driven versus shareholder-driven. But quickly on GDP, because you mentioned happiness indicators, there's a whole movement to add to GDP wellness and well-being and happiness. My point is, hold on, Just like my husband says, every time you bring something in the house, two things have to go out of the house. Before you bring in happiness into GDP, let's take out the rent. And unfortunately, when you don't have a real discussion about theories of value, we also have a confusion between rents and profits. And I would argue that much of what is in the UK's GDP today is rent in the form of unearned income. But if you don't have a theory of rent, and it's just a theory of some sort of competitive price that can be a bit too high, a bit too low, that's competed away, it becomes very hard to rid GDP of rent.
I'm going to try and go towards what to do, but I want to keep you at the kind of, because you and I spend a lot of time trying to break open orthodox economics to audiences of orthodox economists, and we're both very well aware of the kind of stuff that they argue. What, for you, is the source of disequilibrium? Because each one of these old theories, the reason they were obsessed with value was that they had a theory of disequilibrium. Adam Smith, the effing rent seekers. With Marx, it's exploitation. With marginalism, of course, it's the market's not working properly, too many trade unions, too many monopolies. What do you think is causing, if you are right, what is causing disequilibrium right now in the system? Because it's damn well not in equilibrium.
Okay, so I guess there's two bits of your question. One is that if you have, again, this problematic notion of where value comes from, and then the state is just coming in always just to fix a problem. So business cycles themselves could be seen as simple market failures, right? Some sort of coordination failure. You have businesses investing too much in the boom, too little in the bust, so government has to do the opposite of that. That was one of Keynes's points. Unfortunately, that's one of the only points that he's remembered for. He also said things like, the point of government is not just to tinker on the edges, but really do what's not being done at all. We should have a discussion in society of what's not being done that we would like to be done. But so if you're always in reactive mode, that helps cause these disequilibriums, right? Because you're always just catching up. And as I said, we're actually back now at the same condition we were at just before the financial crisis. First of all, the profit-wage ratio is at one of the highest levels it's ever been. This is something that is unfortunately not well understood when people just look at things like inheritance and wealth in that static way. But what's actually driving through the way we're producing and the way we're sharing the wealth from the production to profits and wages, and is it just that labor unions have become weaker, or all these corporate governance practices themselves really increasing all these rents, which then get called profits, which then we think are also linked to productivity. But so if you're always in catching up mode, fixing, whether you're investing in things like, or creating carbon taxes to control for pollution, or investing in science to have a more innovative economy, you will never really be driving the system. And so by having a concept which is about co-creating and co-shaping markets in that more Polanyi-esque way, that I think would not so much get rid of disequilibria, but make sure that it's not because you're catching up to something that constantly is, creating a disaster and then you have to fix it, but might also be because you're trying to get things done and you make mistakes and then you have to learn from those mistakes. But what we're currently doing is allowing a highly imperfect system, which actually is constantly creating huge amounts of people that are unemployed and that don't have then access also to resources that are key. I mean, they're human rights. We actually don't have, by the way, an economics of human rights, which is very interesting. We have economics of public goods, but not human rights. And then having to, the welfare state come in and put in a bit more money here and there. So I think coming back to this idea of value as co-created and then markets themselves as co-shaped would immediately put the macroeconomist and the the policymakers both looking at the macroeconomy, but also at the details around energy, innovation, and labor in a very, very different position. And it doesn't mean that you wouldn't have mistakes, but you wouldn't be allowing the system itself to drive the disequilibrium, you just coming in with bandages, which the whole market failure notion of policy, I think, drives.
Okay. I've been thinking about this institution, actually. It's a public institution, British Library. Marx came here, and he didn't, and getting the famous Reader's Pass was quite difficult. You have to lie. I think I lied when I got my first one. It's quite easy to get one now. What he studied, of course, were public information. It was the blue books of the British state, and they were produced to try and measure GDP. There's an amazing circularity of sitting here and discussing this. But if we take your idea of the co-creation of value, the public realm not necessarily being a drain on the market sector, which is how neoliberalism sees it, how do public institutions begin to argue their case or express what they really are if they buy your theory?
So Rolly and I, Rolly Keating, he's here somewhere. Where are you, Rolly? He was here. Yeah, where are you?
Up there.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, we need flashlights. So we did the first joint sort of talk in this series, and I was actually interviewing you in some ways about questions like that. So we discussed also the experience of the BBC, which where Rolly was one of the leaders as well there, not just at the British Library. And I've always found very interesting this question that you just asked when you look also at the concrete experience of particular public organizations. And the BBC is quite interesting because every year, or every time it goes through the charter review, it ends up getting accused of, crowding out business broadcasters. And so, you should really kind of define your space and go back to doing what you're supposed to be doing, which is just fixing the public good problem. Again, in this kind of market failure notion, where you kind of assume that there's an existing market. Think of it like a pizza. I'm Italian, so I think in that way. And there's one slice of the pizza that, the public sector, so a BBC kind of institution, should be allowed to tread in. So, documentaries about animals, high quality news, but they're very good, by the way, the Clean Oceans one, of course, was inspired by Attenborough's Blue Planet. But why are you doing soap operas? Why are you doing talk shows? That's for business, right? So it's quite extraordinary when you don't have an understanding, again, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but it's really important, of kind of co-creating and co-shaping value, then you also get this notion of, okay, value is really produced in business, and then a BBC or a British Library kind of institution is, of course, allowed to come in, and we treasure it, it's so important, but only in this little space here. And if you do anything more than that, you're crowding out the wealth creators, right? Whereas if you actually look at why the BBC has been so successful, unlike some other very good but not successful public broadcasters like PBS in the US, which has a minimal market share compared to the BBC, is precisely because it's dared to tread in these other spaces like soap operas and talk shows through a very active commitment towards the word public value. And it's really extraordinary. That word doesn't exist in economics. We have words like public good, which I just mentioned, which is something you have to correct because businesses aren't producing it, but there's no real kind of cross-cutting notion of public value. And it's extraordinary that the BBC actually has not just had that, but it has been, this word that I keep using, contested. There's fights, kind of, well, what's public value? Should you or should you not be creating soap operas? What kind of soap operas? What should be the message? Why are we different from a Berlusconi-produced soap opera? And I can tell you, they're very, very different.
Also known as Italian politics.
But I think it's very interesting, actually, to use cases like that. And there's not that many, because unfortunately, most public organizations have just accepted. We're just there to level. Of course, we can't decide, what needs to be done. We're just there to set the rules of the game. Or if it's something like the BBC, we're just willing to be on the sideline when the really great wealth creators do the kind of the fun stuff. And so debunking that and making it also getting citizens to be engaged in that. Just imagine if citizens were part, for real, of the charter review. What kind of value do we want to be produced on TV and why?
Obviously, one of the sort of dichotomies that you discuss again and again in the book is between the old distinction between profit and rent in classical economics. And I think it's arguable that we are today surrounded by rent-seeking businesses, the huge tech monopolies, the kind of platform monopolies, the Airbnb and Uber type people. But we also, because after 3 decades of financialization, this mentality has seeped through to the individual person. So it's quite common to hear people talk about my net worth is X. What they mean is the interest rate on me is also Y. People conceive of themselves as sort of lifetime financial assets. Now, in this context, the famous phrase by John Maynard Keynes, where he advocated the euthanasia of the rentier, the euthanasia of rent-seeking classes who drain, as Keynes put it, the wealth from the productive sector. I mean, when I use that phrase, there's a lot of eyebrows go up. But what should we do? Since rent-seeking has become not just so central to the elite capitalists, but to people, if you've got an Airbnb or you're an Uber driver, you're thinking of yourself, I'm monetizing my asset, the car. How do we deal with this?
So I think there's, it's very funny, I keep thinking this is like a lollipop or an ice cream. That's huge. There's two different points there. So first of all, it's very interesting to remember what Adam Smith said about the free market, right? It was free from rent. Free from rent. People think he meant free market means free from the state. And because it's been interpreted as free from the state, what you end up getting is this dynamic where, and I don't even want to say the free marketeers because that's one extreme, but this notion that we live in a market economy, then the state should just, as I said, have this kind of limited role and is always just catching up. Again, just think of what's happening now around the data issues. It's just catching up. Oh, we have to go regulate. Then, ironically, that actually allows much more rent to be extracted, right? So when you don't have an active state, a state literally doing the kind of things that Margaret Vestager is doing right now in the European Commission. She's I think, really a hero of our time. She's the competition commissioner. She's the one who's really kind of putting a thorn in the side of some of these tech companies in terms of taxation, which is, it's extraordinary the amount that is both evaded and avoided and tax, and it's huge compared to how much then these companies, spend on kind of doing their good on areas of the green economy or whatever. So could we just get the tax paid and then have kind of democratically elected and peer-reviewed processes deciding which kind of renewable energy and green economy to structure rather than well-doing philanthropists, as much as philanthropy is important, and it's a very important part of emerging ecosystems of public-private third sector, again, going back to the business models which are problematic that generate those cash piles in the first place. But Adam Smith's notion of free market as free from rent, I think would be very interesting as a guiding principle also of many ways that governments think of their role, because you would immediately no longer have half the policies we have in the UK. So the patent box, I don't know how many of you know what this policy is. It was a tax reduction that was instituted, lobbied for by one company. I feel like saying the name, but then I'll probably get sued. Anyway, a pharmaceutical company. And monopolies are already, patents are already 20-year monopolies. You have 20 years of monopoly profits when you patent something. The last thing you want to do as a policymaker is reduce the tax on profits that have been earned through a 20-year monopoly, because the patent already took care of that, right? You want to think of all sorts of different policies that will increase the amount of research, for example, that generated that patent in the first place. But that policy actually came from, as I mentioned before, also in the case of the capital gains tax, through a very strong lobby around wealth creation. And if the government always just had also in its eyes, the need to distinguish these areas of value creation from value extraction, with value extraction being the way that rent actually gets produced, then again, so many, I can just think of 10 different examples like that of policies which actually just ended up increasing inequality. Because guess what happened with the patent box in the UK? 8 billion tax revenue goes down. What do? Let's cut the arts programs. Let's cut some health, right? So many of the things that we're always catching up on, no, spend more on health, no, spend more on education. Of course we should, but let's also look at what's actually happened to government revenues falling because of this constant rent seeking, precisely in governments which have tried to diminish their role because of this kind of free market idea, which is not Adam Smith's idea. That's very important to say, because the Adam Smith Institute is very different from what Adam Smith says.
Okay, maybe they're here. We'll throw it open to the floor. I don't know what our format is. Is there a microphone that goes around? There is at the back. Put your hand up if you want to ask something or say something. Madam there, you, in the blue and white dress.
Hello?
Yeah, it's fine.
My name is Emanuela Todd. I'm a great fan of yours, and I want to make two provocative statements because I really value your intellectual enterprise. Now, in your book, you mentioned that the concept of value has gone to strategy. So why you are not opening the debate, bringing this strategy on board? Because there is huge literature on global value chains, on international trade theory. It's too narrow economic, and obviously it's almost you are demonstrating once again that the economic theory has exhausted its capacity. And one other comment on multinational enterprises that have internalized not just the global value chain, they have internalized markets, intra-firm trade. So what the economic theory thinks about multinational enterprises, it's too eclectic. It's really not a sound theory. And the last point about enablers. Now, we know from economic theory the factors of production, capital is a strong one. It's very difficult to determine which part of capital is productive, which part is unproductive, and which part of capital is enabling to lock these factors of production into value creation, and what are the other enablers, which comes from strategy, again, hugely tricky.
Right, so just in case people didn't catch the first bit, what I say in the book is that, ironically, and it's not really the key bit, but that ironically value has gone from being super contested within economics departments in the way that economists used to fight amongst each other to, again, in economics it's just called Econ 101, the word value doesn't even occur, and yet in business schools, and this is what you meant by strategy, not in business schools, that's all you hear about, value this, value that, value chains, I give that example, shareholder, value-based pricing. So what I argue is the way it's been captured actually by business schools, but in a, and I don't want to sound completely like a snob, but in a not very rigorous way, the rigorous method in economics departments was incredibly problematic. It's not rigor for the sake of rigor, that's not the point, but it's a very fuzzy concept. You know, value-based pricing in business schools, I'm sorry, is not contested. Shareholder value is, to some extent. There's all sorts of different ways to do corporate governance. Unfortunately, the trajectory is not away from it. I was just speaking to people from China last week, and funny enough, the concept of shareholder value is actually rising in China. So we haven't actually debunked the underlying assumptions in the theory of shareholder value. We've just critiqued it for being too short-termist. That's why the critique is so weak. If you just say, look at the negative effects, that causes us to focus too much on quarterly returns. Many business schools look at that. But they haven't actually unpicked the concept of value, underlying shareholder value. So what I argue in the book is not, let's bring it back to the economists. I have absolutely no desire to make economists seem more important than they are. But I'm sorry, I talk to people in government all over the world, and the economic reasoning behind net present value, cost-benefit analysis is the way that the Treasury, for example, evaluates the BBC, right? So we have any sort of public investment is actually looked at through a particular lens, which is fed to them through very problematic economic theory. What I argue is that when that theory itself is no longer explicitly debating value, because they literally just call it Econ 101 in that sense, right? Because there aren't different theories of value being debated anymore. There's one, marginal, neoclassical economics. Then it becomes extremely hard actually to change things. And so since the financial crisis, so little has changed. And it's not enough to just look at the symptoms of things like short-termism. We have to unpick the underlying value propositions. And you're right, though, that the more interesting conversations are in business schools, not in economics departments. That's why, by the way, 60% of economists who are doing interesting things actually in the REF, this research assessment exercise that we all do in universities, get evaluated through the business schools and not the economics departments, because economists love killing each other over, that's not real economics. And the more interesting conversations are actually in business schools. But I would hardly say that they've been the places where value is debunked. I think they're propagators of an incredibly problematic system.
Chi, you put your hand up. Down here. Put your hand up again there.
Hi, and thank you very much for a red mic. So I'm Chion Wora, and I'm the Member of Parliament for Newcastle Central and Shadow Minister for Industrial Strategy, Science and Innovation, and a great admirer of your work, Mariana, as you know. I noticed that politicians weren't in Adam Smith's list. And I do want to definitely say that it does depend on what we're doing, as well as our profession. And the other point I would make is that not all in the Labour Party reacted to the 2015 defeat by seeking to further embrace business. But my question is around financialization and the structure of the economy. So reducing finance, do you recognize a difference between producing things and producing services? And how do we reduce financialization where producing things, manufacturing capital requires far more capital investment. And I suppose to illustrate my question here, if somebody working in Redcar at the steel plant goes to work at making sandwiches, if they are made collaboratively and meet your criteria, is that still producing value in the same way? And does the fact that they may well not be as proud of producing it make a difference?
Great question. And the reason I thought actually Adam Smith was incredibly simplistic, unlike both Ricardo and Marx, is precisely because he did what you're, I think, assuming should not be done, which is just to make a list. You know, you're good, you're bad, you're in, you're out. Which instead of relating it to how things are being produced and what are they being produced for. And, you know, Marx had his narrow, if you want, way to look at that, but a much broader way would be, you know, what are the goods and services and new forms of collaborations, I think ways in which different actors in the economy, collaborate in organizational forms, institutional and organizational innovations themselves, right? Which are ways of relating to one another, should also be we should put attention to them in terms of thinking about how to create value. But I often look at Denmark as a really interesting example because you have, you know, in terms of the green economy, which really is the next, I mean, if we don't solve that, right, if we don't get, and not just economy, a more sustainable and green way of not just producing, but distributing, consuming new ways of life, what we consider to be the good life, to be a greener, more sustainable way, we're in trouble. And what Denmark has done by actually having a type of finance that has been nurturing its economy, as opposed to one form of financialization, which is finance feeding finance, and other parts of finance, right, which is the kind of Andy Haldane graph up there. And also companies that are driven more by stakeholder governance, not shareholder, maximizing shareholder value, right? So Vestas and other green companies, as well as in Scandinavia in general, you have Ericsson, which is a really functional company compared to some of equivalent companies in the US, which again have over 100% of their net income on share buybacks and dividend payouts. By having actually both a producer-centered understanding of a green economy, actually producing not just renewable energy, but greener cities in terms of what has to be produced. They've produced really green services. So they have a whole area of green services, green high-tech services, which they are now exporting to China. So China's spending 1.7 trillion on a broadly defined word, the green economy, which includes not just renewable energy, but energy-friendly technologies and all sorts of other areas in terms of a green direction for the whole economy. And Denmark is the #1 provider of high-tech green services to China's green economy. And that's, you know, for a little country, that's extraordinary. And that's precisely because it's done things in a much more visionary, mission-oriented way, for example, by really thinking about, you know, how do we make Copenhagen and other Danish cities really interesting places to live in. And that's not just about goods, it's about new forms of relationships and different ways that you structure. Anyway, I think I've said enough there, but definitely it includes services. And if we also then train people, and if companies are also reinvesting their profits back into production, you also get workers in theory, lower areas of the value chain also being invested in. People are worried today about robots taking jobs. They're not taking jobs. Ricardo, back in 1821, had a chapter in Principles of Political Economy called On Machinery, and he said, uh-oh, we're screwed. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't say that. We're in trouble. All these machines are taking jobs. You know, we're gonna have huge unemployment. Exactly what people are saying today. Then what you had for 200 years is the profits being generated from machine A were reinvested back in the economy in another part. So you actually had creative destruction in terms of new jobs arising. That's what stopped in the 1980s, this extreme form of financialization where companies, and you saw that in the business investment figure, but also in this kind of share buyback trend, which is only increasing. Under Steve Jobs, Apple didn't do share buybacks. He actually invested back into design and all sorts of other things. Under Tim Cook, this is their big plan, the kind of share buyback mode with Carl Icahn sort of breathing down their necks.
I want to try and get a couple of more questions in. Let's take them together. Actually, a man there in a blue shirt. We'll take three.
Thank you. This was a wonderful talk. I recently read David Graeber's book, Bullshit Jobs. And So I'm wondering, in the context of a lot of the macro level discussions that you're having here about value, he makes the argument that maybe 40 to 50% of all the jobs that we're doing don't really produce any value. And so I'm wondering if that is the case, moving forward, what does that mean for us as a society in terms of, are we, should we be having a discussion about increasing value, or should we be having a discussion of, well, maybe we should just try to rest on what we have and work less? I'm wondering, how do you reconcile
Thank you.
that?
I've only really got time for one more, and it's a woman up there with a hand up there, with a bright necklace. Sorry, I'm just so hot, I can only see some vague outlines without my glasses. And while you're thinking of your answer, Mariana, we are time limited, so briefly, please.
Thank you. Very quickly. Can you pretend to be a maker but actually be a taker at a local service level? I'm thinking about public service. And how do you talk about that at a very public service level, please?
4 minutes for the whole
I
answer.
gotta think about that one. I'll ask you a question when I get to that one. So the first one, David Graeber, I actually gave that to my dad because he's always complaining about, because he does nuclear fusion at Princeton University. He says, all these administrators in the university, they're just administering stuff. There's not enough, investment in people like me, he says, doing the fusion. I talk about this concept in the book of performativity, right? Which comes sort of from philosophy. So how we judge the performance of things, literally how we evaluate them. I mentioned the Green Book, right? When we do net present value and cost benefit analyses, that then affects what people do, right? And that feeds back into, there's a feedback loop, into how we then kind of evaluate them. It's this self-fulfilling, kind of self-reinforcing mechanism. So rather than saying, that's a bullshit job, that's a great job, that's a bullshit job, we should be asking ourselves, how have we come to a system where we've allowed, in the health sector, for example, there to be this rapidly rising number of managers, again, whether they're really doing nothing or just doing too much management, and not enough nurses and doctors, and not enough discussions about how to structure the healthcare system in a way that actually produces value. I mean, if you look at the PFI schemes, the private finance initiatives, and these private-public partnerships, the problem with the word partnership is there's different types of partnerships. If you're married or not, you'll know there's different types of partnerships. Some are good, some are bad. But any biologist will tell you that an ecosystem can be predator-prey, it can be mutualistic, it can be symbiotic. What kind of ecosystem are we building in the healthcare sector, right? So instead of saying bullshit jobs, how have the ways we've been valuing or not valuing healthcare then structured the current division of labor, whereby we are overvaluing some things like management? We see this in the universities. One of the things with universities is there should be a very clear distinction between governance and administration. What we've had increasingly in the UK universities is the administrators are actually governing, right? And so that's not saying that someone's doing a bullshit job or not. It's the way that we have allowed a system to be evaluating what academics are doing based on problematic measures, which we can just rethink. There's no reason we shouldn't rethink it. Wait, where are you? There you are. So are you saying that so instead of saying that, you have all this value extraction in, say, financial services that we can restructure, but even how local or national or regional governments operate, lots of it is kind of extracting value? I would argue that that's exactly what has sometimes happened because of, again, coming back to this performativity thing, that when you have an idea of what government's for that is so reduced to just kind of fixing things with no ambition, as soon as you have any sort of ambition in the civil service, you're accused of either picking winners or, again, I mentioned crowding out. So you also, that affects who you bring in, first of all. It's quite extraordinary. When Obama said, you know what, not only are we going to have a stimulus, something that Europe forgot, $800 billion is what the US government spent on its post-crisis stimulus, but we're going to green direct it. We're going to direct it towards the green economy. Then the Tea Party got in the way, but we kind of forgot about the Tea Party, right? We got other problems now in the US. But they totally got in the way. They said, no, you can't meddle, just let the market decide if we go green. He really said, no, we're going to do this. And you know what? We're going to set up a really ambitious public institution that is similar to what happened with the internet, where you had DARPA, financing the internet. We're going to do the same thing in green, ARPA-E. And the top people in the US said, we'll work. I want to become a civil servant, please, right? So you make it really exciting to be a civil servant when you say, you're not just going to do a carbon tax, you're going to help co-create this thing called the green economy. So he got Steve Chu, a Nobel Prize winner in physics, directing the DOE, who set up ARPA-E, which this guy Arun Majumdar ended up directing. Google thought he was like the best thing under the sun, so when his 5 years were up, because that's how long you're allowed to work in these institutes, he went to work in Google, right? Which is exactly the opposite of what I see happening in so many public institutions. And that is why, by the way, the British Library, the BBC, GDS, which in this country was really revolutionary in what it did with the digital platform. Why? They said, citizens aren't clients. They're not customers. These words should resonate, right? Because that's how we talked about patients in hospitals, or clients or customers. They're users. They use this stuff. We got to really form the best kind of, in the case of healthcare system that the user experiences the best ever. That's very different from thinking of it as a client relationship. And in terms of how they actually structure the digital platform was very much around that. And that affected who wanted to work in GDS. Whereas when you have the opposite, at best you're fixing market failures, you're leveling, you're de-risking. I almost fall asleep saying it. Who are you going to bring in, and what kind of incentive schemes will there be? What kind of hiring practices, career structures will there be when you're not allowed to fail, for example? If you fail, you're in the front page of the Daily Mail. Whereas we all know you'll never know how to ride a bike if you're not allowed to fall down, but we no longer invest in public institutions and the capabilities and capacities to learn, to fall off the bike, to learn how to do it better next time, to experiment. When Steve Jobs told the Stanford graduating class, you have to be hungry and foolish, well, are civil servants allowed to be hungry and foolish? Of course not. That's why they're depressed. And that does actually, sorry, it's the third time I've said that, but it's true.
Right. Well, on an uplifting note, I can tell that in the audience there are so many questions that people want to answer, but want to ask. But that is a good way to end, because it leaves people hopefully thinking about the issues that Mariana has presented tonight and wanting to read the book, Mariana Mazzucato, The Value of Everything. On the back of it, it says, don't mess with Mariana Mazzucato. She is the world's scariest economist. But I think you can, that was the Times. But I think you can understand where those who are scared and why they might be scared are probably with some reason interested in this work. It is most definitely not abstract. It is being talked about, studied, I think will be implemented here in the United Kingdom, hopefully, as policy. And so do take the book away, buy it, take it to your book group, study it, fire questions at her, go to her courses. And thank you for coming. And thank you, Mariana. Thank you.